So I switch to German now.
Yes, and if you're hearing this, it means that you found us, so welcome. Welcome on stage 2 for our last session on the last day of Republica, and I'm very glad that the Digital Society, Digitale Gesellschaft, is here tonight for the evening of net politics. And some of you may know that the society founded itself on Republica in 2011, and in the meantime it's become very active. It's conducted a lot of campaigns, and it has a public event once a month that is being recorded and streamed every time on the first Tuesday of every month. It's normally held in the sea base in Berlin. But this month it's being held on a Wednesday here at Republica, and we're very happy about this. I'm very glad that you're all here, and I will now hand over to to the people from Digitale Gesellschaft, Volker and Alexander. Thank you.
Hi. Guten Tag. Hello. Yeah.
Hello. Welcome on the evening of Net Politics. Thank you, Sandra, for the announcement. It's our 48th event that we're holding tonight. We are holding this event usually on the first Tuesday of every month in the sea base. That's at Jannowitzbrücke and S-Bahn station. The entrance, the admission is normally free. There's always free, and it's usually being streamed on seabase.org. And you can find the recordings on YouTube afterwards, so you can watch it later as well. It's normally 2 to 3 talks on current topics in net politics, but also some topics that may be missed by mainstream discourse. So it's a very nice event. And as Sandra said, as we founded ourselves on Republica 2011 at this very place, we're using the opportunity to hold our evening at Republica in May of every year to talk about current campaigns and the things that are going to happen in the coming months. We're an organization in Berlin, and we work on digitization and the interests of consumers. We also work in education of youth and adults, and want to bring about decisions for a free and open internet and for the protection of consumer rights. And we're going to present 4 topics today that we are currently working on, or that we've been working on quite intensely. Volker, our political president, is going to talk about Wieland-Störerhaftung,
subsidiary liability, I think.
Which is a subject that's been occupying us for quite a while. And the reform of European copyright, which is something that we're anticipating to see more of this year. And in the second part, I'm going to talk more about TTIP, especially the TTIP leaks that just went out, and their relevance in net politics. And then we will talk more about the storage of passenger name record data, and to see what effect that is going to have. And I want to hand over to Volker. Thank you. Hello, everyone. The first topic I want to talk about is the liability for disturbance in Wi-Fi. Some of you may not know what it's about. So, what's the problem here? What's the idea of this liability? If you're opening a Wi-Fi hotspot, it means that you can be held responsible, you can be held liable for whatever crimes people who use that hotspot commit. And due to that risk, many people use a password and use encryption on their Wi-Fi to prevent people from freely accessing their hotspots. And that's the reason why we do not have do not have a lot of public Wi-Fi hotspots in Germany. And this is all due to a rather unclear ruling in the law on digital media and the way that the Federal Court of Justice interprets this ruling. And this ruling was when the Federal Court of Justice first defined the issues that this opens, and it means that the network providers cannot be held liable, but the people who open their networks can be. They can be held liable if somebody commits copyright infringement through their networks or commits any sort of digital crimes. This means that Germany only has about 2 open hotspots per 10,000 inhabitants. In the United Kingdom, it would be 28, and in South Korea, it would be 40 per 10,000 people. So what can be done about it? The Digitale Gesellschaft drafted a new law in 2012 on how this liability could be abolished, and it entered the German Parliament twice in the past, since then, and it's still in the German Parliament, and I'm going to talk about that later. And the Ministry of Economics provided a new draft of the draft for how this liability could be re-implemented, and faced a lot of criticism for it. They subsequently published a frequently asked questions, but that didn't really help either. So what's in this draft? There are many things that you might welcome at first glance, which means that the people opening their Wi-Fi's would be treated equally to access providers, which is essentially what we've been asking for. But there's a catch. There are conditions that you need to fulfill to be precluded from these liabilities. So you have to ensure that people cannot access your network without authorization, which means password protection. You must ensure that people who use your access points sign a legal waiver, essentially.
Is to have legal safety for open networks, and open networks do not have this kind of securing, because that means that anyone can access them, so there is a contradiction in itself here. That was one slide too fast. So what now happened exactly? After this draft was put forward, the whole thing has to go through a procedure at the European Commission, the notification procedure. European law says that any time that a rule for services of information society should be changed as a member state, I cannot just do this by myself. I have to inform the European Commission about it and give them a chance to check whether that is compatible with the internal market. So that took place until December, and there was a decision then that was not public at the time. Nobody knew what was in it, and not even the parliamentarians knew. Even those from the governing parties, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats. So the whole thing was drafted, but the parliamentarians that would eventually decide didn't know. But then there were leaks through the site online and netzpolitik.org, and the ruling said that the draft law went against European law, particularly the e-commerce directive. And the whole thing then somehow didn't catch on, neither with parliamentarians or the government itself, because they then went through the cabinet and resolved to move the bill on, and okay, that was interesting. European law doesn't really matter, or what? And then the second chamber of the parliament that represents the federal states had its say. They have to have their say in every legislation process, bar a few exceptions. So they were then advocating for a whole for that liability for disturbance to be abolished. And then there was an expert hearing in the Committee for Economics in the first chamber in the Bundestag, and that's where even the governing party's own experts really picked that draft apart. They simply said this is all against European law. It cannot possibly go this way. Well, that caused a lot of uproar, of course, but also people were just clueless. And then it was the end of the year and things were relatively calm. By the beginning of this year, behind the scenes, there were negotiations between the two parties, the CDU-CSU union and the Social Democrats. Certain deals were proposed, and by March 2016 it was clear, the last negotiation rounds, it was clear that the negotiations had stalled. Now, a new thing comes into play that had been in the background all the time, and that was a complaint, or rather a procedure at the European Court of Justice, which went against Sony Music. Now, an event technician from Hamburg that runs an open Wi-Fi, and someone offered a music song via some file sharing. He got into trouble and before the court, and I think it was in Munich, not Hamburg, and the court said, well, what about this liability for interference? Is that actually compatible with European law? And moved the case on to the European Court of Justice. Luckily, the money was provided for this, and that then, by now, this case faced exactly the questions that had been facing the government as well. What about compatibility with the e-commerce directive? And that finally led to a final plea in March by the General Advocate, someone who, before before everything closes and the judges withdraw to find their judgment, the advocate said, well, European law takes precedence. Those that give access to others is not liable for any infringements without any needs for any additional rules. So the current law in Germany went against European law. So now some ministries that previously had quite actively pursued their interests in this draft law somehow just moved away from this draft law and said it would not be possible to impose restrictions on operators of open Wi-Fis. But still, in the parliamentary parties in the Bundestag, not much happened until yesterday. The Bild-Zeitung, Germany's largest tabloid, reported that Chancellor Merkel had spoken and said, well, go ahead, finally finish off this liability for interference and get a deal. The whole thing became quite embarrassing because it's actually quite a small change in the law that this is all about, and we're working on it for years and years. And the thing is, we are going against the standard that's used in the whole world. And we can be really, it will be really interesting how this is going to go on, because of course, there is a draft law from the opposition parties based on our own proposed law, which is still hanging in Parliament. There was one reading at the plenary and one decision at the committee stage, where the SPD and the Social Democrats and the Conservatives all rejected this. But the second and third reading hasn't happened yet. So if people really want and want to go ahead quickly, conforming with European law, abolish this liability, you don't really have to do anything but agree to this opposition suggested this law, which of course through party politics is not very likely, but if you really are serious about it, this is how it could be done. And that is where we are right now with the liability for interference. And it's going to be very interesting. And the last hint, this all will have to happen before the Parliament summer break, because after that, the election campaign for the elections in autumn 2017 will basically start. So if it won't pass through the Parliament, if it will pass through Parliament before the summer, we will have open Wi-Fi, and if not, we'll probably have to wait a few more years. So next topic, which I want to talk about a bit, is EU copyright reform, which is now ongoing, but honestly hasn't come very far. So this is more of an outlook on what is going to come. Now, the current copyright law has the problem that it doesn't really exist, because up to now, intellectual property was governed by a territorial principle. Member states basically made it up for themselves. There are some directives giving rough guidelines. There's IPRED about the enforcement of intellectual property rights, e-commerce directive, which is about telemedia and providers and what are they liable for. Meanwhile, the EU has the competency for a proper legislation procedure. They could actually enact real legislation, but they started from 2013 to 2014 with a consultation. And they were asking where the pressures lie, what could be done, where is there a need for regulation, and also the European Parliament has dealt with the question. Pirate Party MEP Julia Reda has worked on this and shown where things could be going, where things could head, and the Parliament voted on this, but very hesitantly and didn't go as far as it could have gone, making copyright law fit for the digital age. Now, what did the European Parliament recommend? It recommended, well, unfortunately, there's a lot that they did not recommend that had been in the Julia Reda report initially. For example, they could not move themselves to recommend for a fair use rule as it exists in the US. We don't really know this in the US. We know it from the US. It exists there. This is an exception to copyright law, which says that if you just use small parts of protected work for non-commercial purposes and more for educational purposes, then you can do this. You can upload, you can copy, and so on. Particularly if the actual owner of the intellectual property does not really have any damage. Also, extending quotation rights, and these two together would result in a kind of right of remix, which we have been calling for a long time. So digital technology, of course, makes rearranging and copying into an everyday technology, a cultural technology, and this technology is still actually being criminalized by the current legislation. And as I said, the Parliament couldn't really get themselves to recommend anything. Geo-blocking also, to propose a clear ban on that is nothing the Parliament could move itself to do. But at least they said quite clearly that panorama freedom has to be preserved. If you don't know what that is, panorama freedom means that if you take a photo in the public space that shows any architectural works or art on buildings, you can do this without asking the rights holders for their permission. And so people said this has to be preserved. And also the ancillary copyright law, very disputed in Germany when it was passed. Again, Parliament said that that cannot happen at the European stage. So the Commission then, after the consultation, said we see a need to act in 4 areas. We want more access to content. We want exceptions for innovative and inclusive society. That's exceptions for people with disabilities, or if these people profit. And creating a functioning market for creative content is something that they called for, to ensure that people can still profit from creative content, and fighting piracy. So how can you effectively get law enforcement going? Now, if you actually zoom into the individual points, you see there is not that much progress. With geo-blocking, for example, there is a consultation of its own from September to December 2015. It took place. Now, most respondents said that we feel geo-blocking as a restriction, and it was said that this should be abolished. And for the first half of 2016, a legislative proposal has been announced, has been said that there would be one. Now, the Commission has to propose a law before it can be enacted or resolved. The Commission is the only institution that can propose a new law. They always start making up the first draft, and then it passes through Parliament and the Council, and then it can become law. So what has been brought on its way, a proposal that is about ensuring cross-portability, cross-border portability of content. So a new EU consumer right is suggested that should enable me that content that I bought in my country can be consumed in another EU country. So if I'm a Netflix customer in Germany and I have to go somewhere, say Poland, where Netflix doesn't actually exist, at the moment you can't really, without any tricks, use Netflix. And that's what the EU wants to change, saying that if I bought this access right in my country, I should be able to use it in another country, which is not that bad. This is supposed to be finished by 2017. It's probably not going to be. Well, we'll have to see. And then there are another number of other measures, better propagation of content, better choice for Europeans, strengthening cultural diversity, cross-border broadcasting for TV content, but there is no concrete proposal for any of this, and how this is supposed to actually go about is not known. And exceptions for people with disabilities, well, Commission says here that there are large differences in member states concerning these exceptions, and it sees a clear need to act. And what's quite interesting is that one of the last items I wrote up there, move it up, the ratification and implementation of the Marrakesh Treaty, which is copyright exceptions for people with seeing disabilities to translate books in large print without an extra fee, for example, or asking for extra permission. Of course, you have to actually purchase the work. Now, the Commission didn't make that much pressure at first, but now it is doing that to get this ratified. Other exceptions that the Commission has seen a need for is panorama freedom, text and data mining for scientific purposes, and exceptions for teaching and online teaching. And again, they say, we see a need to act, but there's no concrete proposal up to now. And even by spring 2016, they said there would be a proposal, but it hasn't happened yet. Now, for creating a functioning market, internal market for content, they say, well, it's getting more and more difficult for creators to achieve that revenue. Creating revenues is shared, or that revenue is shared fairly if you upload content on YouTube and it gets consumed a lot, the people that profit first is the platforms. Now, how can we make the creators, the artists, properly profit from this? Creators often have the problem that they cannot actually, they are not even in a position to negotiate the appropriate conditions and insist or control what happens to their content. So that is where the Commission wants to do something, which seems very reasonable. But the question then is, how exactly is this going to happen? How do we get these platforms to look up to their responsibilities? And also, quite strongly in focus, hosting provider and communication services. Hosting providers, of course, are something that the copyright industry sees with distrust, because they mostly look at one-click hosters in that context, which is, of course, where online piracy happens a lot. But hosting providers basically are all services that offer storage space on the internet. So anything where user-generated content can be uploaded and stored. So in other words, these are services from one-click hosters via YouTube, Facebook, Wikipedia, and any kinds of services that store information in the internet. So we can see that host providers are not one and the same thing, and that could lead to problems. So the Commission then says there are gray areas that can lead to legal insecurities and uncertainties. What, for example, is a public performance, and what is public access to content? So in legislation, again and again, shortly we had a ECJ decision about this. It's not clear what the situation is, and the Commission would like to resolve this and clear this and say what can be done and what cannot be done legally. And also, what's important in this area is liability for host providers, again linked to the previous topic of liability for interference or disturbance. The thinking had been that liability should be upgraded, but there was such a lot of doubt about this that that was kicked out again. So this is a field where the copyright industry does a lot of lobbying, and you have to keep a very close eye on this to make sure that there is not a constant monitoring of all content that is being uploaded, and that there's no blocking or things like that. So this will be a very interesting battleground. And also aggregation services, that is something where there's a need to act. The newspaper publisher that would like to earn a share of Google News revenue or something, so they would like a usage right. Oettinger seems to be sympathetic to this. This is the ancillary copyright topic, so you can be interested. It's going to be interesting. Again, a proposal was announced for spring 2016, but it hasn't been put forward yet. And the last item, and that again, we can look forward to very intense conflicts here. Piracy, how do we achieve use effective law enforcement here? Again, a proposal has been announced, or which is basically a follow the money approach. The idea is to look where the money from commercial copyright infringements goes. So they want to make it easier to find where does the money actually go to, where are the people that profit from these pages. And then the idea is to find out the need to reform the IPRED, the enforcement directive, and run a consultation on that. And this has started now it goes until the autumn of this year, and suggestions are supposed to be tabled there. And we have developed a tool with which you can take part in this consultation. You can find it on our website, and there are some aids to answer those very abstract questions, and so that you know how best to deal with this kind of consultation. And that is basically what is going on with copyright reform. So it's a quite open playground right by now, and you'll have to see what exactly will be coming forward, will be forthcoming. It's good to take part in these consultations and kind of define the spin and say this is where it should go. What then will come of it in the end is completely open, and I'm sure for the next few years this will be something we need to deal with. Thank you.
We are going to continue with a topic that passed through the European Parliament about 2 weeks ago, which is the bulk storage of traveler data, mainly airline passenger data. It's being stored by airlines to ensure a smooth travel. And it makes a lot of sense, you know, when you book a flight, you want to ensure that you get your seat, you get the special meal you've booked, you get special assistance if you've booked it. You want to catch your connecting flights and make sure, you know, the airline ensures that you can catch these flights. And these passenger name records, PNRs, are being collected and stored by airlines since the 1960s, and they've grown and grown ever since. So by now, per flight, per passenger, there are about 60 data points stored in your passenger name records. Amongst them, this is what a PNR file might look like. Of course, there's your name, but also your phone number, mobile phone number, your home address, your email address if you, maybe your IP address if you've booked the flight yourself online. And this is a kind of data point that you may wonder why it's actually necessary to be in your passenger name record. Payment data is in there as well. Health data, any special meals you have requested. And the pinnacle of all this collection of data is that it contains a free text field in which airline employees can enter their own information on the passenger. For instance, that you call the hotline a lot of times and complain about the airline. So yeah, the airline might note that you're a bit annoying. And security employees have the option as well to add their own information to the PNR. This is one example of this, where a passenger had marijuana stickers and was traveling with a book on cannabis. And this is the kind of information that may end up in your passenger name record. This can all be freely accessed by the airline, but also by security employees at the airport. And this very kind of information is apparently, is apparently necessary for fighting terrorism. And this access of passenger name record data first became known to the public after 9/11, when all airlines that fly to the United States were required to submit passenger name data to the United States, where they are going to be stored. And the airlines wanted to end this kind of legal uncertainty, because they also have to comply with European data protection regulations, and they were unhappy about having to submit them to the United States as well. So they negotiated an agreement with the European Union, and with a lot of back and forth, a passenger name record agreement was agreed upon with the United States, and now all passengers who fly to the United States or to fly above the United States will see their passenger name record data submitted to American government agencies where they are going to be stored for 15 years and used for terrorism prevention. It's fairly obvious what's going to happen with this data. They're going to try to find the needle in the haystack. They're going to use to profile them and to create new suspicious people. And this means that government agencies in the United States will be able to see what somebody ate on their flight 15 years ago from Frankfurt to New York. And this seemed such a great idea that the European Union decided to implement this for the European Union as well, the so-called UNR, EU PNR system. It was presented to the public more than 5 years ago, and it was agreed that to store data for 5 years, to create suspicions, to actively create suspicions. It was plainly said that this data was collected to find people who had not been suspicious so far. And there was a lot of back and forth. There was a vote on it in the Interior Committee of the European Union, which led to it was rejected by them and then went to the plenary body of the European Union. But it was a bit unclear if there could be a majority, so it was resubmitted to the Commission. And now, after the most recent terrorist attacks in Paris and Brussels, the pressure grew so much that this passenger data is now, this storage of passenger data is now underway. And the implementation deadline has started to run, has been put in place, and all that is necessary to actually store this data is going to be implemented in the next 2 years. And this is problematic because there is a ruling by the European Court of Justice which says that this bulk storage of data is against fundamental human rights in the European Union. And it's also interesting that the European Court of Justice is currently debating on another agreement on the storage of passenger name record data, which is the agreement with Canada. Because after the agreement between the European Union and the United States, there were further agreements with Canada and Australia, which now store the data for 5 or 5.5 years. So now there are 3 agreements that are all different in the duration of how long this data is being stored, and now there's a European agreement as well. So it seems very arbitrary. And this is because the European Commission, as well as the other states have been using this data, are still unable to prove that it's actually served a purpose. They so far only made accusations and recounted anecdotes that it might be useful. And there was a debate on this with Canada, and the European delegates were skeptical and ensured that they were skeptical about fundamental rights, and thus submitted it to the European Court of Justice, where it's still being debated. And 3 weeks ago, the European Commission was asked why it felt that it was a reasonable measure. It was a very long inquiry of 6 to 7 hours, which is a bit atypical in this case. It was very critical towards from the judges, and especially as far as the communication data storage regulations are concerned, we can suppose that the European Court of Justice is going to reject this bulk storage of passenger name data. And even though this one agreement was sent to the European Court of Justice, the European agreement was voted into law, which is slightly strange, because you might have thought they would wait until the European Court of Justice had finished their ruling on the other agreements. We think that by July we will see first results from the European Court of Justice, whilst the 2-year deadline is already in place in Germany and other countries, other member states, to implement this PNR agreement. And it's going to be very interesting to see if it actually can come into law, if the European Court of Justice rules against bulk storage in the case of the agreement between the European Union and Canada. In any case, we're going to continue fighting against the EU PNR system. We spent the past 5 years to lobby in Parliament against this, to do this in the member states. It wasn't enough in the end, and the only recourse we now have is legal action against these agreements. We can already announce that we're certainly going to take legal action against it. We're going to keep monitoring the subject. For instance, there are other states like Kuwait or Mexico, Russia, that are also interested in the passenger name record data of European citizens. So it's definitely something that will keep us busy for the coming years, even though it looks like it's over. There's still quite a lot of things going on a political and legal level.
And that probably gets us to the most interesting topic of the next few days, and that is the TTIP leaks. The thing is that on Monday, Greenpeace, as you know, published these negotiation documents that reflect the current state of negotiations, or maybe not the current, but the state from a few weeks ago, or maybe some time more, and they show the position that the EU and the ones that the US have for on the topics that are given here. And for us, actually, this is quite relevant. The area of electronic communication and the telecommunications market. And it has to be said that there are other net political topics that are negotiated within TTIPs but have not been part of those leaks. More on that later, but first let's concentrate on this, on what has got to the public as part of those Greenpeace leaks. Now, TTIP is of course negotiated in secret. For example, the EU Commission, there have been 13 negotiation rounds since 2013 when negotiations started. The EU Commission publishes, well, papers of a few pages where they report about the most recent negotiations, say how they went, what the positions of the EU were. You don't really know what the US positions are, but what is published by the EU Commission also is fairly vague, and you cannot really see what the current state of negotiations is, and that's why these leaks are so relevant to us. So, because you can see how far these negotiations have actually gone, or, on the other hand, where there are very different positions and opinions on topics between the partners, and to what extent the positions are apart. Now, telecommunications market is very relevant for us and interesting because for quite a long time We have been dealing with the topic of net neutrality. And net neutrality, that means that all data in the net is treated equally, independent of sender, receiver, and content of the data. And this is important because that is basically the fundamental principle of the Internet, the way it works. And that's what made the Internet what it is today. If you change this principle and introduce a two-tier network or two-class network through what's called special services, in the short or long term, this will lead to consumers needing a large purse to access the Internet that we know today, but not having the opportunity to use, say, broadband-intensive services such as YouTube for normal rates. And this will also lead to the whole startup community being pushed off the market and new commercial offerings having a very hard time to persist or prevail on the market. Because these services will then have to buy fast lanes from providers to make their content arrive at consumers smoothly. So the thing is that in the US is quite friendly towards net neutrality. They have rules on this. At the beginning of the debate, it seemed that in Europe we would be having friendly rules concerning net neutrality too, but mainly towards the end of negotiations between member states and the EU Parliament on net neutrality, this was abandoned more or less, and we have a regulation on net neutrality now that doesn't really guarantee net neutrality, and that is quite unsound in the way it's formulated. There are contradictions, and the European regulation authorities, the regulatory authorities, which would be the Federal Network Agency in the US, and at the European level it's called BEREC, the roof umbrella organization of all European regulators, have time until the summer to find how this regulation that has been passed should be implemented in detail. So this is something like, is zero rating allowed or not? This is what the regulation authorities now have to deal with, and that's why it's so interesting when telecommunication providers come from the US to Europe or the other way around. And if through TTIP, rules such as net neutrality will be influenced, and if via TTIP certain rules that we have or rules that the US has can be declared void by arbitration courts. And the deciding topic here is the way that the negotiation documents show it, is that the regulation authorities such as BEREC or the German Federal Network Agency will be given wide-ranging competencies. The way the text is formulated, companies will be able to go to the regulating authorities and demand that certain rules from a regulation, for example, should not apply to them. They may apply to the whole industry. For example, if as a provider you go to Germany and imagine that BEREC decides that zero rating is not allowed, and then American companies could come and say, well, according to our view, this will destroy our business model. We absolutely want zero rating. We need this for our markets, blah, 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 whatever they can come up with for as strange reasonings. But they then could exclusively go to the regulating authorities, and they could then find or rule whether the regulation on zero rating will be abandoned. And that makes the regulating authority into a kind of legislative body, which is completely intransparent and without any way will involve civil society in a democratic kind of process. So these decisions could simply be made on this level. And what's also interesting is that individual providers, for example, could go and ask for exceptions applying just to them. And that is quite interesting, how that should be compatible with fairness principles that derive from the EU contracts, the EU treaties. how that could be enforced, and at what point TTIP, where TTIP should be viewed. Is it above European law? Is it the super right that was created, or is it behind, below the primary right, but above secondary right, so that individual regulations through TTIP could be circumvented? And that, it seems here that these regulating authorities have an immensely important role and are being immensely upgraded in their importance, in their ability to make decisions that are intransparent and that can very hardly be reversed and have no transparency and are not democratic. So rules that have been democratically achieved through a democratic process and have been implemented through TTIP could be reversed, so that things like zero rating could somehow, rules on that could somehow come under attack. Another thing coming from these documents is what actually is not contained, and that is data protection. The thing is that there are no data protection guidelines in there at all. At least in the documents that have been leaked, nothing can be seen. So if there is no reference to this at all, whether any kind of data protection rules should apply or not, surely this means that the companies want the lowest possible standard, or will choose the lowest possible standard. We know this from the times, well, even current times, when the European data protection regulation is not yet implemented. You see things like Facebook is in Ireland in order to achieve the lowest possible standards. We have seen this, and this is then probably the threat is that this is going to happen in the same way. US providers coming to the European market, offering their services, and of course then they store their data in the US, and the question then will be how this data will be transmitted. Is this stupid privacy shield going to apply, or is the European data protection regulation going to apply, or nothing at all? There's simply no reference in the text whether any data protection law should be applied, and if, which one. So there is a new threat coming from this. If personal data from Europe will find its way across the pond again without any kind of sufficient controls and consumer interests not being preserved. So this is what we find from those leaks, and it's comparatively unlikely if you see what's also negotiated in TTIP, for example, in the net politics area. There you have in the 12th negotiation round, you had e-commerce as a topic, which mainly means copyright questions, issues, intellectual property. So that whole nonsense that we have dealt with when we had the ACTA debate, this is back in the negotiations. Again, we don't really know what the current state of things are. This is not in the current leaks, because these are fairly recent negotiations. But again, there is the threat that the kind of ACTA zombies will re-emerge, and copyright regulation through TTIP could be unhinged, and you can imagine that perhaps we'll manage to fight for a good copyright reform within the European process that Volker just talked about, and then there is TTIP, and all this could be destroyed through this kind of international trade agreements. And again, we do not. The only thing we know is that this is being negotiated, and what actually is the content, what the positions are, and how far they are apart is completely unknown at this point. And we just hope that soon there will be new leaks that will perhaps give us some more certainty on this. And what's also the case is that with TTIP, since Monday, many people say the thing is now dead in the water. Even the EU Commission has said that it's now going to be rather difficult to get TTIP actually finished in time. But you shouldn't write it off too early, because as long as these kind of treaties are under negotiation, you have to expect that they actually will get to the ratification stage. Although, of course, basically it is going to be quite difficult to find agreement. This is less because of the net politics topics, but more fundamental issues such as the secret arbitration courts that the US are insisting upon, while the Europeans suggested a somewhat more transparent solution with more open and transparent courts. So these are very large debates and issues that can be seen from those documents. That we can see that in these fundamental areas there are large differences of opinion, and with the way it is, at least with the leaks now, with what we know from the leaks now, it should take a lot of time to actually find a common solution. And the two parties do not have much time left to actually get this trade agreement finished. It's quite close, quite similar to the way that the Wi-Fi liability for interference was. They have a deadline for this year, which is kind of funny, because as soon as every time the year starts, we hear by the end of the year we'd like the whole thing to be finished. They have been saying this for a few years now, so this kind of statement that they want to get it finished by the end of this year has to be taken with care. But particularly if you look at the way the negotiations stand, but if it will not be possible to get this finished by the end of this year, it will be very difficult after the US elections with the American side to continue negotiating, because TTIP is more of an Obama project, and the other candidates for the presidency that are in the race, for now at least, are more critical of TTIP. So you can assume that TTIP will either be negotiated for a long time or never become reality, but just as we've seen with ACTA, we see that there are other trade agreements that are being negotiated. So the path, this way of influencing laws through transparent negotiations and international treaties, that is where only a very small number of people are actually involved in the negotiations, from the view of governments, has been successful and will continue. And laws that cannot be brought to pass through the normal parliamentarian procedures will be enforced or will be brought on the way through treaties like this. So solutions that people would like will be put through, and the parliamentary process will be circumvented. So there is fairly much time to do this. Look at CETA, and there's TTIP, there is TPP. There's a whole row, or a whole sequence of agreements that are being negotiated, and they all have one thing in common. They are negotiated in secret by a very small circle of people. It's not transparent, and at the end, the finished text will be given to, say, the European Parliament, and sometimes also the member states for ratification, which then at the end will be able to say yes or no, but not make any changes to those texts. So this is why we have to keep a close eye on this and see what happens with TTIP, but also with new agreements that might be on the way to keep accompanying these processes from the start. So what should have become clear from all this is that topics like this that we work on take a lot of time, a large. There is no solution for many of these copyright reform. If it will be carried out in all those details that the Commission is thinking about, it will be a large project. European data protection reform. We've seen this with European data protection reform. If copyright will take the shape of a regulation, it will take a long time. We've seen it with PNR that started in 2011 and has been in the works till February 2016. That is the EU agreement. And TTIP also started in 2013, and a few years ago We, at Republica here, we were celebrating the demise of ACTA, maybe now of TTIP, but probably in 2 years' time we'll be talking here about the next agreement. So I know that we'll have to finish, so very quickly, one more point. Our next Net Political Evening will be back at Seabase in the usual location, and there'll be the stream. If you're not from Berlin and came here just for Republica, you can look at this at seabase.org or on our YouTube channel afterwards. That's it. Thank you, Alexander.